Sirens wailed in the distance as the pregnant woman pressed her back against the cold brick wall, sweat beading under the weight of fear. A massive dog stood only a few steps away, barking with a frantic urgency that made onlookers recoil. Some grabbed their children, others reached for phones. Judgments spread faster than truth. The woman's trembling hands shielded her swollen belly, her breath shallow as two officers sprinted toward the scene, hands near their weapons. The crowd expected violence. The dog expected salvation. But only one of them knew what was buried under the earth at her feet. Before the truth unfolds, remember to subscribe to my channel, Racism Untold Stories, where we reveal the hidden battles behind everyday injustice. The dawn unfolded slowly over the city, pulling shadows back from the worn sidewalks and tired buildings that lined Mariah's neighborhood. It was a place where morning light never arrived softly. It scraped against weathered brick, revealing everything people tried to hide. Trash bins leaned sideways like they had given up long ago. Laundry lines swayed with the uncertain breath of the wind. Stray cats slinked through alleys with the same cautious determination that lived in the hearts of the residents. Mariah stepped carefully over a cracked stretch of pavement, steadying her balance with one hand on her lower back and the other curved instinctively over her belly. Her pregnancy had entered the stage where each breath brought a quiet ache, and each step felt heavier than the last. The baby inside her pressed forward as if reaching for the world before it was ready to receive them. Mariah whispered loving thoughts to the child each morning, soft words that lived only in her mind, because she often felt that no one else around her would understand them. She lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment that held more dreams than furniture. A chipped dresser, a small table she had repaired herself, a bassinet she had found at a second-hand shop, now polished so carefully that it gleamed with hope. She had covered the walls with gentle colors and handwritten affirmations that reminded her of the person she wanted to be for her child. She did not have many resources, but she had a fierce, unwavering love that filled every corner of the small space. Life in her neighborhood had taught her caution from an early age. The buses ran late. The streetlights flickered more than they shined. The city made promises to improve infrastructure but rarely returned to fulfill them. The residents learned to rely on themselves, and in Mariah's case, that meant walking everywhere, even while pregnant, even in pain, even when the world judged her for things that had nothing to do with her character. Her prenatal appointment that morning had been long and exhausting. The doctor had mentioned the stress on her body, the swelling in her feet, the need to rest more often. Mariah listened politely, though rest was a luxury that rarely belonged to her. She walked out of the clinic with her medical papers tucked into the pocket of her hoodie. Moving slowly toward the nearest intersection, she hoped to reach home before fatigue took over, but the bus schedule was inconsistent, and waiting in the open meant dealing with the stares of strangers. So she took the familiar shortcut. The shortcut led through the wealthier district that bordered her side of town like a polished mirror, reflecting what the city believed success should look like. The contrast was immediate. The houses stood in proud rows, surrounded by trimmed hedges and fences that looked decorative, not protective. Well-fed dogs lounged lazily in sunlit yards. Sprinklers arched perfect fountains of water over emerald lawns. Cars gleamed in driveways like trophies. Everything felt staged, curated, managed. Mariah never belonged there, and she felt the invisible reminders of that truth every time she passed through. People stared longer than necessary. Their eyes measured her clothing, her hair, her dark skin, and the curve of her pregnant belly. Some gave tight smiles meant to seem friendly, but carried an undertone of unease. Others avoided looking at her entirely, as if acknowledging her would blur the clean lines of their comfortable world. Still, the shortcut mattered. It saved her 20 minutes of walking, and when every muscle in her body screamed for rest, 20 minutes could mean avoiding a dangerous fall. She pulled her hoodie a little tighter against the breeze and stepped onto the pristine walkway that cut directly through the district. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted toward her. Mixing with the faint sweetness of blooming flowers arranged in precise clusters, the air felt different here, as if purified. Even the birds seemed to chirp with a practiced rhythm. Mariah walked with careful steps, not wanting to disturb the perfection around her. She admired beauty easily, even when it belonged to spaces that did not welcome her. She imagined what it would be like for her child to grow up in a place like this, where safety was assumed and not earned. She imagined parks without broken swings, schools with functioning heat, grocery stores without expired produce pushed to the front shelves. She imagined free afternoons, calm mornings, nights without sirens. Her imagination softened her exhaustion for a moment, and she allowed herself to breathe slowly under the reaching branches of a large oak tree. The sunlight flickered between the leaves, scattering warm shapes across the sidewalk. She closed her eyes briefly and listened to her baby moving gently within her, a reminder of the life that depended entirely on her strength. When she continued walking, she felt the familiar weight of judgment settle over her again. A jogger passed her, glancing over his shoulder with a suspicion that he did not bother hiding. Two mothers pushed strollers on the opposite sidewalk and whispered to one another as they watched her. Their eyes sharpened when they noticed her worn shoes and oversized hoodie. Mariah was used to it. She had long learned that people with comfortable lives often invented their own threats, and those threats almost always looked like her. She kept her gaze forward and walked with a quiet dignity, refusing to shrink under their assumptions. She was halfway through the neighborhood when she heard a rustling from behind a tall hedge. The sound pricked her nerves. Her steps slowed. Out sprang a German shepherd, powerful and alert, its coat shining like polished metal in the sunlight. Mariah froze instantly. Fear rushed through her body with a force that nearly made her stumble backward. She had always loved animals, but in pregnancy her instincts had shifted, pulling her into a space of protection and defense she had never experienced before. Her heartbeat quickened, her breath thinned. The dog stopped several feet from her, tail stiff, chest rising and falling rapidly. It barked once sharp, piercing, urgent, not the deep growl of an attack, not the casual bark of a bored pet. It sounded like an alarm. The sound drew immediate attention. A woman watering her flowers looked up and gasped. The jogger returned, staring with narrowed eyes. Two children riding bicycles slowed to watch. A man across the street pulled out his phone as if he expected the scene to escalate into something dangerous. Mariah raised both hands instinctively over her belly, stepping backward until her spine touched the cold surface of a brick wall. The dog barked again, louder this time. Its paws scraped the ground, pulling at something unseen. Its eyes kept flicking between Mariah and the soil near her feet. She could not understand what the dog wanted. She only felt the pressure of the crowd's assumptions closing around her like a tightening net. The dog barked again, and again, and again. The residents watched with tense anticipation, their expressions etched with fear and judgment. In that moment, the dog was the danger, but to them, so was she. The world held its breath. The dog dug its paws into the earth. Mariah pressed her back harder against the wall. She did not know yet that something beneath her feet was waiting to be uncovered. She did not know that her presence had disrupted a dark secret. She did not know a storm of misunderstanding was about to break open. All she knew was fear, and every pair of eyes that blamed her for being afraid. The dog's barking grew louder, slicing through the immaculate calm of the wealthy street like a siren that refused to be ignored. Each bark echoed off polished windows and marble driveways, carrying a desperation that did not match the peaceful scenery. The air vibrated with tension. Even the birds grew silent in the trees above, as if nature itself sensed the imbalance beginning to take shape. Mariah remained pinned against the brick wall, hands trembling over the swell of her stomach. Every instinct urged her to flee, but her legs felt heavy and uncertain. The child inside her shifted again, a small reminder of life, vulnerability, and hope pressed beneath her ribs. She breathed slowly, trying to steady herself, but the dog's intensity only heightened her fear. Residents continued to gather, pulled in by the spectacle. Curiosity mixed with suspicion, forming a toxic haze that settled over the scene. A man in a designer sweater moved closer, keeping his phone up as he recorded every second, framing Mariah and the dog in a narrative he had already decided. His expression remained stern, almost hungry for something dramatic that would justify his fear. Two teenage boys whispered to each other, glancing at Mariah with the same careless judgment that often came from youth bred in comfort. A woman stepped forward, clutching her small dog to her chest, her eyes wide with alarm. She stared at Mariah as though she were the unpredictable force in the situation. The wealthy residents had spent so much time sheltering themselves from discomfort that the sight of a black woman, standing frightened on their street, triggered an immediate assumption of guilt. Their biases festered in the spaces they never examined, the silent corners of their minds that painted strangers with the colors of fear and suspicion. Mariah could feel their gaze pressing against her skin, heavy and suffocating. She had endured this type of treatment for most of her life, but pregnancy made everything feel sharper, more personal. It was no longer just about her safety. It was about the child who had not yet taken their first breath, but was already experiencing the weight of prejudice. The dog lunged forward again, claws scraping the earth with frantic energy. Clumps of soil flew in every direction as it dug at the patch of ground near her foot. Its body trembled with urgency. Its ears remained pinned back. Its eyes darted between the earth and the people gathering around, pleading for understanding in a language only instinct could translate. But the crowd ignored the meaning behind the dog's behavior. They saw only a threat, and they projected that threat onto Mariah. A child clung to her mother's leg, pointing at the scene with confusion. The mother wrapped an arm around him, whispering fears that were never based on truth. Her voice carried easily in the quiet neighborhood, seeping into the air like oil. The judgment spread even faster than the fear, shaping the perception of everyone present. That was when the police car turned the corner. The blue and white vehicle rolled down the pristine street with authority, its presence dominating the scene. The officers inside carried the confidence of men who performed their duties in affluent districts, where calls rarely involved danger, but often involved assumptions. They parked quickly, stepped out, and scanned the area with rigid focus. Their hands hovered near their belts. Their eyes darted between the barking dog and Mariah pressed against the wall. The crowd surged forward, eager to offer their version of the story. Fingers pointed at Mariah. Accusations spilled out. Words like trespassing, aggressive, and dangerous came from lips that trembled with performative fear. The officers absorbed each statement without question, forming an image in their minds that matched the residents' fears more than the truth unfolding before them. Their posture stiffened, their attention locked onto Mariah as if she were the reason chaos threatened to bloom in the perfect neighborhood. Mariah felt a familiar dread crawl up her spine. The arrival of the police did not bring her comfort. It seldom did. She knew too well how quickly situations like this could escalate, how an innocent moment could morph into a life-altering event. She stood completely still, not daring to make a sudden move. Her breath tightened with every second. The dog barked again, loud and explosive, refusing to let the officers ignore him. The officers reacted with caution, stepping back slightly, unsure whether the animal posed a risk or served as a warning. The dog's body remained angled toward the patch of earth, not toward Mariah. He pushed his nose into the soil again, pawing urgently. Something deep within the officers' instincts tugged at them, urging them to look closer. But the bias fed to them by the crowd held a stronger pull. One officer began to approach Mariah, his face stern, his steps measured. The other moved toward the dog with a hand extended, as though preparing to restrain it. The residents watched with anticipation, ready to see the situation resolved in a way that validated their assumptions. The dog reacted immediately. It darted forward, planting its paws firmly into the disturbed soil. Its claws tore through the top layer, revealing a darker shade of earth beneath. Dirt spilled over the sidewalk. A faint metallic glint caught the sunlight. The officer nearest to the dog paused mid-step. The dog dug deeper, desperate, frantic, relentless. A small chain emerged from the earth, thin and tarnished, yet unmistakably real. The officer's eyes widened as he crouched down. He swept more soil aside, revealing fabric beneath the surface. His breath caught in his throat. He reached out with trembling fingers and brushed away another layer of dirt. A child's shoe stared back at him, so small, so fragile, so horribly out of place. The crowd gasped collectively. Fear shifted into confusion. Confusion dissolved into shock. Their narrative began to crumble. The officer called for the second one to join him. Both knelt beside the disturbed ground, hands working with urgent care. More fabric appeared. A small arm, a faint movement beneath the soil, a living body, a child. Buried, shallow, breathing faintly. The dog barked again, but this time the sound held triumph, not fear. The officers worked quickly, pulling the child from the ground, brushing dirt from their face, checking for breathing. The child's chest rose weakly. But it rose. Mariah's knees threatened to give out as she realized the magnitude of what had been uncovered. For a moment, the world blurred around her. The stares, the accusations, the fear she had endured. Everything merged into an overwhelming wave that threatened to pull her under. But the truth stood in the open now. The dog had been trying to save the child, and Mariah had unknowingly stood near the only clue. The officers shifted their focus rapidly. Their earlier assumptions vanished under the weight of undeniable evidence. Their stance softened. Their attention finally drifted from Mariah, no longer fueled by suspicion, but anchored in the urgent rescue. The wealthy residents looked on with shaken expressions, their polished certainty shattered. The image of danger they had projected onto Mariah dissolved into their own guilt. Their wealth had not shielded them from the truth hiding beneath their perfect lawns. Their privilege had blinded them to what truly mattered. The dog circled the rescued child once, as if ensuring they were safe before stepping back. Its breathing slowed, and its posture relaxed with relief. Mariah watched the ambulance arrive, watched the officer step aside, watched the paramedics carry the child away with care. Her heart pounded with lingering fear, but now it had room for something else: recognition, vindication, and a dawning understanding that prejudice had almost overshadowed a life-or-death truth. The dog had been desperate for someone to listen, but the people had been too busy judging her to hear the warning. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a heavy finality that echoed across the pristine neighborhood. The sirens remained silent as the vehicle pulled away, carrying the dirt-covered child toward a future that was still uncertain but no longer buried. The residents watched it disappear down the road, their once confident faces now pale and shaken. The dog sat a few feet from the disturbed soil, chest rising and falling in slow, exhausted breaths. Its work was done, but its vigilance remained etched in every line of its trembling body. Mariah stood motionless, pressed against the cold brick wall, as though her spine had fused with it. She tried to steady her breathing, but the world around her swayed with the weight of everything that had unfolded. Her heart pounded heavily beneath her ribs, pulsing with the remnants of fear, injustice, and disbelief. The child's discovery had cracked open a buried truth, but the aftershocks trembled outward, touching everything and everyone. The officers had shifted their stance, no longer postured for confrontation, but instead caught in the silence of dawning realization. Their earlier assumptions pressed down on them like a thick fog. They looked at Mariah with a new awareness, but the damage of their first judgment still lingered in the space between them. No words were spoken aloud, but their expressions carried the unspoken weight of what almost occurred. It had been close, too close. Reality had teetered on the edge of disaster, balanced precariously between prejudice and truth. One wrong movement, one additional assumption, one further step driven by fear rather than fact, and the situation could have spiraled into something far darker. The realization sent a chill through Mariah's veins. Her knees wobbled. She pressed a hand to her belly, grounding herself, feeling the subtle shift of life within. The child inside her was safe, but she could not shake how quickly innocence could be endangered by another person's unquestioned bias. The residents began to disperse into shaken clusters. Their voices dropped into hushed murmurs. Their eyes avoided Mariah now, no longer sharp with suspicion, but heavy with discomfort. They carried themselves with a stunned uncertainty, unsure how to reconcile the image they had created of her with the truth revealed before them. The perfect lawns, the expensive flower beds, the flawless driveways, all of it, felt hollow now, exposed by the dirt lifted from a place that was supposed to symbolize security and privilege. Beneath their manicured grass had lain a horror that none of them had noticed, because they never imagined a threat could exist inside the boundaries of their insulated world. The dog walked toward Mariah slowly, its steps careful, as if sensing her trembling fear. It stopped several feet away, lowering its head in a gesture of calm reassurance. Mariah looked at the animal with a mixture of awe and sorrow. The dog had fought desperately to save the child, but the people who should have listened had turned their fear toward her instead. If the dog had not been relentless, if its instincts had not been stronger than human prejudice, the child might have remained hidden forever. A sudden gust of wind stirred the remaining loose soil, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of earth overturned. The officers began to widen the digging area, searching for any evidence connected to the child's burial. Their gloves brushed aside roots and stones, their radios crackled with urgency. This was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was now a criminal investigation that struck at the heart of the community. Mariah watched as a small object glinted beneath the crumbling soil. One officer retrieved it, lifting it carefully into a clear evidence bag. It appeared to be a charm or bracelet, a tiny piece of jewelry once worn by a child. Its delicate surface reflected the sunlight in fractured colors. The sight of it tightened something deep in Mariah's chest. It reminded her that the world could be unspeakably cruel, often to its smallest and most vulnerable. The second officer found footprints nearby. They were faint but visible enough to suggest someone had been there recently. Someone who had placed the child beneath the earth. Someone who had walked away, confident that the ground and the neighborhood's illusions would conceal the crime. The residents stepped back further, retreating into the safety of distance. Their perfect lives had been disrupted by the truth, glaring up at them from the soil. Their biases had nearly obscured it completely. They were forced to confront a reality they had avoided for years. That danger did not only look like the people they feared, sometimes it wore familiar faces, sometimes it hid behind wealth, sometimes it walked through their very own yards without raising suspicion. The officers called for backup. More units arrived. Yellow tape began to unfurl across the lawn, bright and jarring against the green grass. Cameras flashed. Investigators stepped carefully around the soil. The dog remained nearby, watching with unwavering attention. Amid the chaos, Mariah stood alone, detached from both the crowd and the investigation. The truth had cleared her, but the emotional bruises remained. She had been treated as a threat for simply existing in a space that judged her before she even spoke. The memory of the residents' eyes lingered painfully, how quickly they had painted her as danger, how rapidly they had stepped away from accountability. Her legs trembled again, and she leaned further into the brick wall for support. She focused on her breathing. In, out, slow, controlled for her child. An older resident, one who had been the most vocal earlier, approached the edge of the tape. He stared at the ground, his expression tight with confusion, shame, and disbelief. He glanced toward Mariah, but when she lifted her eyes, he looked away instantly. Unable to endure the weight of the truth he had helped distort, the investigators lifted the child's shoe from the soil and carried it toward the evidence truck. The symbolic weight of that tiny object rippled through everyone watching. It represented innocence. It represented ignorance. It represented how easily truth could be buried beneath assumptions. The dog gave a soft sound, almost like an exhale. It walked in a slow circle and finally settled on the ground. Its courage had saved a life. Its persistence had forced the world to pause. It had seen the truth long before anyone else did. Mariah lifted a hand toward the dog, not touching it, but acknowledging its silent heroism. A quiet understanding passed between them, one built on instinct, fear, and the small miracle they had both witnessed. The officers approached Mariah at last. Their posture held a gentler weight. Their expressions softened with sincerity that felt overdue. They stood before her, not as enforcers of suspicion, but as men who had realized they had almost been misled by the prejudice of the moment. Mariah exhaled slowly. The air felt heavy, saturated with truth. She felt the shift happening around her. She felt the weight of her own survival, of the child within her, of the child rescued from the earth, and of the community forced to see the truth they had tried to bury beneath their privilege. This was the breaking point. The moment the narrative shattered, the moment the truth rose higher than fear, the moment the injustice exposed itself fully, without mercy or disguise, everything would change now. For the residents, for the officers, for Mariah, for the child who had been saved, and for the truth that could never again be buried. The hush that followed the rescue was not peace. It was the stunned silence of a community forced to look at itself. The air felt heavier than before, as if the morning had been remade by the weight of what had been pulled up from the earth. Mariah remained pressed against the brick, breath steadying now, but not yet calm. Her hand rested protectively on her belly, feeling the small, rhythmic movements of life that refused to be overshadowed. The dog sat a short distance away, muzzle lowered, chest rising and falling with exhausted gentleness. Its once frantic energy had gone. In its place was a quiet watchfulness that carried the whole morning inside it. The animal had been the bearer of truth, its instincts louder than the assumptions of an entire street. It had refused to stop until a child had been found, and that refusal now sat between the witnesses like an undeniable fact. The paramedics finished their checks and closed the ambulance doors. The medical team moved with practiced care, but their motions did not erase the rawness that lingered in Mariah's shoulders. She had been seen through a lens of suspicion until the soil itself negated the story people had told themselves. That reversal left a residue of anger and relief braided together inside her. Around them, the neighbors drifted in small, awkward clusters. Their conversations were low and fractured, as if they were unsure where to put the words that had nearly been unnecessary. A few faces showed genuine shame. Others showed that old, awkward bewilderment people wear when the stories that sustain them collapse. The polite distance that had once separated Mariah from them now felt like a guilty chasm, a reminder of how casually they had assumed the worst. An officer stepped forward slowly, his uniform unremarkable against the backdrop of manicured hedges and flawless lawns. His posture had changed over the course of the morning. The rigid confidence that comes with patrols in privileged neighborhoods had softened. He looked at Mariah with something like apology in his eyes, though no words offered the right shape for what he had almost done. Mariah recognized that look. She had seen it many times, the flicker of understanding that came too late. She did not step away. She did not strike a heroic pose. She kept her composure, measured and still, allowing the truth to stand its full length in front of every witness. The investigators widened the examination, lifting small fragments of evidence into sterile bags. A child's shoe, soil turned up by frantic paws. The shallow depression where life had almost been erased. These objects moved slowly into official hands and away from the chaos of accusation. Cameras recorded evidence, but they also recorded faces, faces that had jumped to conclusions, faces now attempting to register guilt, faces that would carry the memory of their misjudgment forward into a future where they might choose differently. A woman who had been the most vocal earlier stood near her gate, her shoulders rigid with embarrassment. For the first time, she seemed small in the scale of her own assumptions. Aware of how a simple, reflexive judgment had nearly escalated into harm, she looked toward Mariah with an expression that was apology without words. Mariah did not nod or accept forgiveness. She did not need the performative absolution of a single moment. She needed the world to change its reflexes over time. People began to help in small, tangible ways. Someone offered a blanket. Someone else fetched water. Acts of practical kindness moved quietly among the crowd, as if small deeds were the first steps toward making sense of what had occurred. Mariah accepted what she needed and declined what she did not, maintaining the boundary that had kept her safe. The dog remained steady, an uncelebrated hero who would likely return to a life without accolades or treats beyond the closeness of the woman he had protected. He moved closer when Mariah stood, nudging her hand with a soft, warm muzzle as if to demand recognition without fuss. She reached down and placed her palm against his head, feeling the roughness of his coat and the steadiness of his breath. The gesture was brief and private, a small ceremony that sealed a bond crafted in crisis. As the neighborhood slowly returned to its routines, the morning left marks that would not vanish easily. Conversations at breakfast tables would now include the day when a dog refused to be ignored and a woman was nearly wronged by the speed of assumption. In offices and grocery lines, people would replay their reactions and carry a small unease that might become the seed of change. Mariah walked home at a measured pace, the sidewalk feeling both familiar and foreign. She passed the oak tree, where sunlight had earlier dappled the pavement. She watched families move through their lives, unaware perhaps that their eyes had once judged too quickly. Her steps were heavy with memory, but also with resolve. She would raise her child in a world that had shown, in one morning, both its capacity for cruelty and its capacity for correction. Inside her apartment, she settled into the small comforts she had assembled with care: a patched table, a carefully washed bassinet, soft blankets folded with intention. The dog rested at her door, content to remain near. She placed her hand on her belly and let the small movements calm the tremors of adrenaline. The life within her continued unbothered by assumption, nudging her gently back to hope. The aftermath would not be a tidy moral. It would be a complex patchwork of accountability, regret, and potential growth. The officers would file reports. Investigators would follow leads. The neighbors would live with the memory of their own haste. But beyond bureaucracy and gossip, a quieter transformation had begun, a recognition that seeing someone fully requires patience and humility, and that instincts are not always enough when they are powered by bias. A question lingered in the air, sharp and unavoidable, ready to be carried beyond the block. Would you have treated her differently if you had known the truth from the beginning? Would you have listened to the dog or to the stereotype? Would you have waited for evidence or leaped to conclusions based on fear? These questions did not need immediate answers. They required contemplation, and, later, action. They required people to notice their own quick judgments and to reforge them into habits of care. Months from that morning when Mariah's child would take tentative steps into a world that had once almost failed them, the memory of the dog and the soil and the confused, guilty faces would remain. It would act as a quiet injunction to look deeper before declaring guilt, to protect the vulnerable even when they do not fit the picture of innocence, to remember that empathy is a more reliable guide than fear. If this story moved you, if it unsettled you into thought, or prompted you to examine your own assumptions, do not let the moment end here. Subscribe to Racism Untold Stories, support narratives that reveal hidden truths, challenge prejudice, and illuminate the humanity we all share. Your subscription is not merely a click, it is an act of attention. It is a commitment to listening before judging. It is a small but meaningful step toward a more just world.